Hello, everyone. I hope everyone had a good weekend. Normally, we do practice sessions around 1 p.m. Eastern Time on Sundays, but this week is a little different since we're doing a topic session on immunity and the endocrine system. I did include some freestanding questions, so I hope there's still lots of participation. Next week, we'll resume back to normal, so we'll have a practice session next week at around 1 p.m. Eastern Time. I do say this every Sunday, but coming to a topic session on a weekend shows that you guys are motivated, so I'm really glad to see some of you guys here. So this is an overview of what we'll be covering today. We'll start off with talking about the immune system, specifically differences in innate and adaptive immunity and humoral and cell-mediated immunity. We'll talk about the different cell types involved in the immune system and their roles as well. We'll then move on to the endocrine system. So we'll talk about different hormone types, their roles, and their respective organs. Good afternoon to you too. That made me happy to see. Okay, so let's jump right into the innate and adaptive immune systems. The innate system is easy to remember. Essentially, it encompasses cells and types of defenses that are not specific to an antigen. For example, macrophages are known for their phagocytosis ability, meaning that they digest whatever they think is dangerous. So this is not very specific. Along with macrophages, we have natural killer cells, neutrophils, mast cells, eosinophils, and basophils. We'll talk about the functions of each cell in a bit. Opposite of the innate immune system is the adaptive immune system. The adaptive immune system is specific and acts slower because our body needs time to generate defenses that are specific to an antigen. So memory is also involved in the adaptive immune system so that our body remembers to attack this specific dangerous thing. Versus the innate system just attacks anything that's foreign. And there are two categories of the adaptive immune system. They include the humoral and cell-mediated immunity. We'll talk about these two categories in a bit. Right, so let's talk about the anatomy of the immune system. The diagram to the right shows you where each part of the immune system is located. Starting off with the bone marrow, can anyone tell me what that's responsible for? Feel free to unmute yourself. I don't want to hear only my voice.
Maturation of the blood cell and also maturation of the B cell and production of a B and T cell.
Yeah. So in this little table, I just made that short. I just said it produces white blood cells, so like leukocytes, which include B and T cells. The spleen over here, I don't know if you guys can see my cursor, but in the diagram where the spleen is, does anyone know what that does? Any guesses?
And production of the immune.
Yeah, you're getting close.
The immune cell?
Yeah, so specifically the spleen is the site in which B cells are activated, and it's responsible for filtering out damaged red blood cells. So what about the thymus?
T cell development.
Yeah, exactly. So the thymus is a site where T cells mature. This can be easily remembered since thymus starts with a T. And finally, what do our lymph nodes do?
It would be where that's where it has a lot of the B cells and T cells that are there, but also, or I guess maybe it goes with the vasculature of lymph nodes, but where it interacts with the blood, and so having that transportation.
Yeah, exactly. So our lymph nodes act as little hubs where our white blood cells can communicate with each other, and it's a site for filtering out dangerous substances. So it like filters out the lymph, which is a fluid that carries our immune cells. All right, can anyone tell me what hematopoiesis means?
Production of the blood cell.
Yeah, so it means the formation of blood components, and it occurs in the spleen, liver, and bone marrow. The creation of differentiated white blood cells begins with a multipotent hematopoietic stem cell. So does anyone remember what multipotent means?
It's a stem cell that is not like the regular. I can't remember multipotent, I believe, but these are pluripotent because they can become into these like myeloid. Well, the CMP and the CLP are still stem cells, but instead of being like omnipotent, I guess, in the way in everything that it can be, as if it was in embryos, it can become a lot of them. So you can see it can become like 12 different cells, but it can't become all cells.
Right. So multipotent is the most differentiated out of like pluripotent and totipotent cell types. So it means the ability to develop into specific cell types since they're like partially differentiated. So the stem cell will differentiate into either a myeloid progenitor cell, where it will become either a red blood cell or part of the innate immune system, or it will differentiate into a common lymphoid progenitor, where it will differentiate into either a natural killer cell, which is also part of the innate immune system, or into small lymphocytes, which make up the adaptive immune system. So like T cells and B cells. All right, one question. Is it misspelled? Yeah, I think I yeah, I think I added that A here. That's probably not supposed to be there. Thank you, Brian, for catching that. All right. So let's jump right into the innate and adaptive immune systems. The innate system is easy to remember. Essentially, it encompasses cells and types of defenses that are not specific to an antigen, like I said. So, for example, so barriers would be an example. So like the skin is a physical barrier, and the skin also consists of enzymes called lysozymes, which digest any foreign particles that come into contact with the skin. So our organs also contain these digestive enzymes, so like stomach acid. And finally, interferons are proteins created by cells that are responsible for stopping the replication of viruses. All right, so let's talk about the cellular defenses. So like we said, macrophages are responsible for endocytosing pathogens and digesting them using enzymes. So once they digest them, they will use MHC proteins to display a part of the pathogen on their cell surface to tell other immune cells that this pathogen has entered the body. All right, so what are proteins? MHC protein, so MHC stands for major histocompatibility complex, which are proteins found in all cells. And their job is to tell the immune system if the cell is healthy or if it's invaded or abnormal. So there are two types of MHC proteins that you need to know. The first being MHC1, which is found in all cells, healthy or not. MHC1 follows an endogenous pathway, meaning that it takes proteins inside the cell and brings them to the surface. You can see how it works by looking at this diagram. These proteins could be healthy proteins, normally found in all cells, or it could be viral proteins. The point is that it comes from the cell. MHC type 2 is only found in infected cells, such as macrophages. So cells that have been invaded by bacteria will phagocytose the pathogen and display the bacterial proteins on the surface using the MHC type 2 proteins. Abnormal proteins found on MHC type 2 will activate the innate and adaptive systems. So the cell will die and antibodies will be produced so that it can kill off more of the pathogen. 1 second while I drink some water. Okay, does anyone have any questions about MHC? Okay. So who can guess what mast cells do? Anyone? Yes, thank you. So they're responsible for releasing a chemical called histamine. Histamine causes vasodilation and inflammation. It does this so that more immune cells can enter the bloodstream and help attack invaders. All right, so what do dendritic cells do? Yes. So dendritic cells are responsible for presenting antigens and warning the T cells of an invader. So they're basically the bridge between the innate and adaptive immune system. All right, before we get into the role of natural killer cells, I want to see where we're at with the MHC concept. So here's a question for you guys. Oh my God, I gave you the answer. Well, if you haven't seen it, please try to read it and think your way through it. Yes, the answer is D. Apart from looking at the slide that I accidentally showed you, why do you think the answer is D? Okay, so I'll go ahead and explain this. When a bacteria infects a cell, it will be digested and its antigens will be presented on the surface by MHC2 proteins. So if the question was asking for MHC1 instead, the answer would be virus. So does anyone want to explain why? Yeah,
That's
exactly.
a little
Oh,
confusing.
sorry.
So all cells, all of our cells have MHC1, but only lymphocytes have MHC2 cells. So why would it not be why would it be viruses under MHC2? Would it because then you would be doing the cell adaptive response or
So the main difference between viruses and bacteria is that viruses inject their DNA into the cell, right? So they do, oh, sorry, RNA. So they do this so that our own cells can make the viral proteins. So these viral proteins will attach to the MHC1 protein. And you can see that in this little diagram here. So once, let's say a helper T cell or a killer T cell, we'll get into that later. But once like an immune cell recognizes this viral protein, they'll start to attack it. The difference between MHC2 and MHC1 is that MHC1 proteins only display proteins that are synthesized inside the cell. So bacterial proteins are not synthesized inside the cell. Does that make sense? So the cell's own enzymes will degrade the bacteria and display its proteins using the MHC2. That's why MHC2 proteins are only found in infected cells.
I have a question. I
Yeah,
understand it's not C because the virus using the cell's own machinery to produce the protein. But
right.
I thought, what's the difference between A, B, and D if all of them are from the outside source as an outside invader?
So yeah, I wasn't entirely sure about parasites, but I like in terms of parasites and fungi, other immune cells would digest those. So yeah, so for example, IgE antibodies would be used against parasites. I will look into that. It's just for the sake of this question, like we discussed, MHC2 molecules will display digested fragments of a pathogen.
Because I cannot quite understand how come parasite and fungal and bacteria would be different way of mechanism of digesting and presenting NHC2.
Yeah,
big?
I get your point.
They're too big.
It could be because they're too big.
Especially for parasites, that's why you have to use the antibodies because it's the IgE that's produced by the B cells, and it literally like caused it to have a little bit like a micelle, and then it'll be phagocytosed. But yeah, like those are freaking like tapeworms, you know?
Yeah,
Oh,
so
that makes sense.
I'm just not entirely sure about fungal infections. I'll have to look into that and I can email you.
Mhm.
All right. Okay. So, does anyone know what natural killer cells do? Yes. So, they are responsible for causing a cell to undergo apoptosis when they're infected with a pathogen, and natural killer cells also help eliminate cancer cells. So we've hit our last category, which is granulocytes. Can anyone tell me what all of the 3 types of cells have in common? Yes, they release granules. So they stimulate the inflammatory response and they help fight any type of infection. You don't need to know the specific differences between neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils, just that they secrete granules, which are enzymes, to eliminate pathogens and fight off infections. Right, let's move on to adaptive immunity. Which will consist of only B and T lymphocytes. So there are 2 categories, like I mentioned, that fall under adaptive immunity, the humoral response and the cell-mediated response. So the word humoral means substances found in the humors, also known as body fluid. These substances will include antibodies, which are secreted by B cells or plasma cells. Plasma cells are differentiated versions of B cells, and its only role is to secrete antibodies. Memory cells are also differentiated. Their only function is to recognize different pathogens that infected the body before and to secrete antibodies so that the body can eliminate the pathogen more quickly. So cell-mediated immunity involves 2 types of T cells, helper T cells or CD4 and cytotoxic T cells or CD8. I included this diagram to help you visualize the difference between the 2 types of immunities. The B cell will secrete antibodies to attack extracellular invaders, while T cells will cause cell death of infected cells. Okay, here's the question. You can type your answers in the chat when you're ready. Yeah, why do you say B?
Because antibiotic is a specific immune system that's not general as the innate immunity.
Yeah, so A, C, and D are all general defenses and can kill anything, but B, like you said, antibodies are part of the adaptive immune system and are specific to antigens. Okay, so this is the structure of an antibody. You have to be able to recognize that antibodies are composed of 2 heavy and light polypeptide chains, and that the heavy polypeptide chains are linked together by disulfide bonds. You can remember the heavy polypeptide chains as being those 2 long chains because they're heavy and the light chains are small. So there are also 2 portions of an antibody. The antigen binding site in yellow, which is specific to an antigen and is variable across all antibodies, and the constant region in blue never changes and is responsible for interacting with natural killer cells and macrophages. There are 5 different types of antibodies you should also be familiar with: IgG, IgM, IgD, IgE, and IgA antibodies. The difference between these types of antibodies you don't have to worry about, just that they are found in different areas of the body and that IgG is the most common antibody. Memory cells do not secrete antibodies, just plasma cells and B cells. That's interesting. Yeah, I learned that memory cells don't secrete antibodies. Their role is to just warn the other B cells and the T cells that this is a familiar attack and to activate B cells specific to that antigen to secrete antibodies.
Oh, oh, sorry, I mistyped the message. I thought you were talking about if we need to memorize different type of the antibody, and do we need to?
Oh no, so you don't need to memorize the different types of antibodies. No, you don't really need to know it. Just that IgG is the most common.
Okay, thank you.
And yes, this recording will be sent to you guys. So we have two types of immune responses, primary and secondary. When we are first exposed to, let's say, a bacteria, we would have zero antibodies specific to that bacteria because this is our first time our body has seen it. But slowly and over time, our body will start producing antibodies specific to that antigen. And once our body has fought it off, it'll stop making antibodies because we already killed the bacteria. And that's where we see our primary immune response. When we are exposed to the bacteria a second time, let's say months or years after this arrow is, the memory cells of our immune system will recognize this bacteria and immediately pump out antibodies against that bacteria to kill it much faster. The primary immune response is typically a vaccine or direct infection of the pathogen, which is why when we're affected a second time, we rarely feel anything or are aware that we're infected. Kind of like how we don't get chickenpox twice. All right, let's talk about cell-mediated immunity, which, like I said, includes two types of T cells, helper and killer T cells. Important fact that you have to know is that T cells mature in the thymus. I'm not expert on the thymus. All I know is that it's where T cells go to mature and it's located here between the lungs. So helper T cells are also known as CD4 T cells. CD stands for cluster of differentiation, meaning a specific or differentiated type of T cell. The role of helper T cells is to recognize that a cell is infected and warn the cytotoxic T cells so that it can so that it can kill the infected cell, and the B cells so that it can make antibodies against the antigen. I said that helper T cells recognize infected cells. So what protein do you think is responsible for displaying the antigen? MHC1 or MHC2? So it would actually be MHC2 proteins. Remember, MHC2 proteins display fragments of a pathogen and never display proteins made inside the cell. So helper T cells would be useful in recognizing bacterial infections. The next type of T cell is cytotoxic T cells, also known as CD8 cells. The role of killer T cells is in the name. Its job is to kill infected cells to prevent the pathogen from spreading to other cells. So how do killer T cells know when a cell is infected? It can be warned by helper T cells, or it can detect viral or abnormal proteins displayed by MHC1 proteins. Remember that MHC1 proteins display proteins made inside the cell, healthy or abnormal or viral. In the diagram, you can see the helper T cell recognizing an infected cell and secreting cytokines. Can anyone tell me what cytokines are? Yeah, they're proteins involved in signaling and can activate cells. So this is how the helper T cells warn killer T cells. You can remember which T cell binds to which MHC protein by using this mnemonic. You can multiply the CD number times the MHC numbers, and it has to equal 8. So CD4 responds to MHC2, 4 times 2 is 8, and CD8 responds to MHC1, 8 times 1 is 8. All right, here's a question. Yeah, why do you say B?
So I just know that from previous knowledge, but also the question says coordinated immune responses, and that's what helper T cells do to stimulate a coordinated immune response.
Yes, exactly. All right. So one thing that can go wrong with our immune system is its ability to be hypersensitive, meaning that the immune cells can attack our own body cells, resulting in an autoimmune disorder. Or it can attack antigens that are not dangerous, like pollen or dog dander, and that would be classified as allergies. So it's unknown what suddenly causes the immune system to go haywire. It could be genetic or spontaneous, since we can develop allergies randomly. And two types of immunity, which you can see in the diagram, are active and passive immunity. Active immunity would be direct exposure of the antigen or a weakened version of the antigen, like a vaccination. Passive immunity would be exposure to antibodies of um, yeah, it would be exposure to antibodies, which gives us some protection against a pathogen. So babies get antibodies from their mom's breast milk, and people can obtain passive immunity from artificial means, like monoclonal antibody treatment, which, if you're not familiar with, are artificial proteins that act as your immune system to fight off pathogens. So your body is not making these antibodies, your body's just introduced to them. All right, here's a longer question for you guys. All right, would anyone like to explain their answer?
I pick C because I initially saw So this involved with the antibody, and also Lucas. Hold on. This is involved in the stimulating the attack damage part on the muscle fiber, and then later cause the inflammation and fibrosis and neocrosis. So, which will be part of the innate system later. That's what I thought.
Right. So the second paragraph gives you a clue. It tells you that the immune system attempts to repair the sarcolemma. So this would be an example of innate immunity because it's a general response. The next clue is the word targeted, which I have highlighted here. This should give you an indication that they're talking about adaptive immunity, which involves specific attacks. So our answer would actually be A, because the innate immune system kicks in first to try to repair the sarcolemma, and then the adaptive immune system kicks in. Does that make sense?
And yes,
Okay.
I will try to reading the paragraph and extract the information, and I did it wrong. Thank you.
No problem.
Also,
Yeah.
it's not true that like the mechanisms of antibodies is that you have to adaptive doesn't happen unless you have innate. Like that's the bridge and the mechanism. Also, like the graph that you showed us, right? Innate leads to adaptive.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you could also use that fact that the innate immune system is kind of like our first line of defense. And also if you read the paragraph, it talks to it like sorry, it tells you that the I guess beginning stages of this disorder is that your own body tries to repair the sarcolemma, so that would be your innate immune response trying to repair damaged cells. And then eventually it talks about leukocytes and a targeted attack, so that would tell you that it's the adaptive immune system.
I have a question about the autoimmune aspect. Would that be considered an innate reaction?
The autoimmune response would be adaptive because your body is secreting antibodies to attack your own cells. So those antibodies are specific.
Okay, so then what was that in the past example you showed us? What made it innate to begin with?
So the innate aspect is your body recognizing the damage and attempting to repair it. So this word repair should tell you that it's innate. So a part of your innate immune system is trying to repair damaged cells.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so this is a summary of what we talked about. I outlined the cells involved in cell-mediated immunity and humoral immunity. You don't have to write this down right away because I will be sending you the slides. I just wanted to show you this outline to help you see things more clearly. All right, if there's no questions, we can talk about the endocrine system. All right, what does the word endocrine mean? Can anyone tell me?
Released into the bloodstream?
Yeah, so it describes a type of gland that synthesizes hormones and releases them into the bloodstream. This is in contrast to the exocrine glands, which secretes hormones into a duct rather than a blood vessel. You can see the differences below a little bit more clearly. So examples of the exocrine glands would include sweat, salivary, mammary glands. And can anyone tell me what a hormone is?
It's a peptide or a steroid or a tyrosine-derived molecule that serves to travel through the bloodstream and cause other bodily effects.
Amazing. Yes, that's exactly what it is. Okay, so let's get into the endocrine glands. So there are 7 endocrine organs that you should be familiar with. The first being hypothalamus, the thyroid gland, the pituitary gland in the brain, the parathyroid gland here, the adrenal glands on top of the kidneys, the pancreas, and finally the testes or ovaries. So chemical messengers in your body can act in 3 different ways. Chemicals that undergo an autocrine action act on the cell that produces it. So basically, a cell is secreting a chemical that changes its own function. An example would be insulin. So we'll talk about this more later, but insulin is a hormone that can bind to insulin receptors on beta cells that produced it. And paracrine hormones act on nearby cells. An example would be testosterone that's produced by the Leydig cells in the testes, which act on the Sertoli cells to help sperm mature. And finally, endocrine action involves a cell secreting hormones which circulate in the blood vessels to act on distant cells. An example would be FSH that's produced in the anterior pituitary gland that travels all the way down to the ovaries. So let's talk about the different types of hormones now, starting with peptide hormones. So peptide hormones are made of long amino acid chains and are unable to cross the cell membrane because they are hydrophilic. So once they bind to the receptor, they can activate a second messenger, which is usually CAMP, or cyclic adenosine monophosphate, or IP3, which stands for inositol trisphosphate. The purpose of these second messengers is for amplification. So one peptide hormone can cause a huge cascade of reactions and can activate a large number of molecules. So these activated molecules will then regulate the transcription of certain genes and modulate enzyme activity. You can recognize peptide hormones by their names. Sometimes they will end with in or "ine", for example, insulin, calcitonin. Other examples are antidiuretic hormone, ADH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, growth hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone. Amino acid derived hormones are, like the name suggests, derived from 1 or 2 amino acids. So you can look at some structures in this diagram here. You can see the amino acid backbone that I circled. I'm not really sure what's going on with epinephrine, but you get my point. So the actions of these types of hormones can vary. Some can be fast but can last for a short time, while others can be the opposite. So examples would include epinephrine, norepinephrine, and tyrosine. The last type of hormone we'll talk about is steroid hormones, which are derived from cholesterol and are therefore lipid soluble, meaning that they can cross the cell membrane quite easily. So once the steroid hormone binds to the steroid receptor to make a hormone receptor complex, it can travel to the nucleus and directly alter the transcription of genes. So this is different than the peptide hormones because peptide hormones indirectly alter gene transcription because they can't cross the membrane. Steroid hormones are easy to recognize because they typically end in "-one", "-all", or "-oid". For example, testosterone and aldosterone. Estrogen, technically called estradiol. Right, here's a question. Oh, that's not a question. All right, does anyone want to explain their answer? Oh, yeah, I see Isabel typed her answer in. So the answer is D. Steroid hormones are slow acting, but their effects are very long term. Like I said, they bind to a receptor inside the cell to create the hormone receptor complex, which directly changes transcription. And since they're derived from cholesterol, they can easily cross the cell membrane. All right, let's dive into the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is located in the brain near the hypothalamus. The neurosecretory cells produce releasing hormones, which travel through the hypophyseal portal system to cause the release of hormones made in the pituitary. For example, the hypothalamus will synthesize thyroid releasing hormone, TRH, which will travel to the anterior pituitary and will make thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. Another example would be GnRH, which is produced in the hypothalamus and causes the release of FSH and LH by the anterior pituitary. Hormones produced by the anterior pituitary include FSH, LH, ACTH, TSH, prolactin, and growth hormones. You can remember all of these hormones by using the mnemonic flat pig. The I would be ignore. So these hormones will then travel via the blood vessels to their respective organs. All right, so in contrast to the anterior pituitary, the posterior pituitary does not synthesize hormones. The hormones are actually made in the neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus and have axons that stretch all the way down to the posterior pituitary and secretes them directly into the lobe. The two hormones that are released by the posterior pituitary and that you absolutely have to know include oxytocin and ADH. Oxytocin is a hormone important in bonding, the release of breast milk, and uterine contractions. Antidiuretic hormone, also known as ADH or vasopressin, is responsible for increasing water retention in the collecting ducts when the blood's osmolarity is too high, meaning that blood volume will increase and so will blood pressure, and the urine will be more concentrated. Oh yeah, I for ignore. All right, here's the question. Sorry, I was muted. Why are you guys saying B? Okay, well, TSH is released by the anterior pituitary. Yes, oxytocin is one of the hormones released by the posterior pituitary. All right, so we talked about how the hypothalamus synthesizes some hormones and releases them into the hypophyseal portal system so that the anterior pituitary can synthesize its own hormones. For example, the hypothalamus makes TRH, which travels to the anterior pituitary to make TSH, which will travel directly to the thyroid glands to make thyroid hormones. An accumulation of thyroid hormones will negatively feed back onto the hypothalamus so that it can stop making more TRH. This is an example of tropic hormones, which in its most basic definition means causing the release of other hormones. GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, is similar. It's made in the hypothalamus and causes the release of LH and FSH so that it can act on the gonads. So direct hormones are a little different. They're made in the pituitary gland and travel to their respective organs, unlike tropic hormones, which act on other endocrine glands to release a hormone. So prolactin, for example, is under the influence of dopamine. With little dopamine, the pituitary gland will release more prolactin, which directly stimulates milk production and mammary gland development. Growth hormone is also similar in that it's made in the pituitary and directly affects the bone and muscle by preventing other organs from using glucose so that the muscle and bones can use it to grow. Right. The thyroid secretes thyroxine and calcitonin, a hormone important in regulating metabolism and calcium homeostasis, respectively. Below is the structure of thyroxine. You can see there are iodine atoms attached to the molecule. Iodine is crucial because without it, the thyroid wouldn't be able to secrete thyroid hormones, and respiratory rate and heart rate will slow down, cold intolerance will ensue, and weight would be gained. Hyperthyroidism is the opposite and can involve weight loss, heat intolerance, increased respiratory and heart rate, and increased body temperature. Calcitonin is a hormone responsible for decreasing calcium levels in the blood. It does this by making bones, kidneys, and the gut increase their uptake of calcium. A mnemonic that I learned is that calcitonin tones the muscles by taking up calcium. All right, so the only thing you need to know about the parathyroid gland is that it synthesizes the parathyroid hormone, which is responsible for increasing calcium in the blood. This is the opposite of what calcitonin does. So why is it so important for calcium to be regulated? Can anyone tell me?
Because the calcium is used as a signal molecule for many of the processes in the body, such as muscle contraction and also the uterus block. I mean, the egg blocking from the multiple sperm.
Yeah, exactly. So calcium is responsible for giving the bones their structure and strength and for regulating muscle contraction. If you recall, calcium is released by the sarcoplasmic reticulum and binds to troponin so that actin and myosin can form a bridge and begin the contraction cycle. Right. The adrenal glands are located above the kidneys. There are two parts of it, the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. You have to remember that both glands secrete different hormones. The adrenal cortex secretes corticosteroids, for example, glucocorticoids, which include cortisol and cortisone. Cortisol is a hormone secreted in response to stress and causes long-term consequences like hypertension or a weakened immune system. Cortisol's immediate effect is that it increases gluconeogenesis so that the body has a fast way to obtain energy in a stressful situation, like the fight or flight response. And it also decreases protein synthesis. Aldosterone is also secreted by the adrenal cortex, and its main effect is an increase in sodium in the blood. It does this by acting on the kidneys, specifically the distal convoluted tubule. As the sodium enters the blood, water will follow. So the end result is increased blood volume and blood pressure. Aldosterone also reduces the reuptake of potassium and hydrogen ions in the blood. So more potassium is secreted by the urine. I'm not entirely sure why this happens. If you guys know, feel free to type in the chat, but you just need to know that potassium and hydrogen ions are retained in the urine.
Wait, what was your question?
So aldosterone increases sodium in the blood by making it more permeable in the distal convoluted tubule, but it also causes the retention of potassium ions and hydrogen ions in the urine. So I'm not really sure why that happens.
It would probably be because it increases sodium in the blood by increasing the amount of sodium channels in the distal tubules, and then because of like the gradient that's made and the osmolarity, you're taking Na out, and so you're going to use the other cations to keep that.
That Yeah, that sounds reasonable. I'll have to I don't know. I tried looking it up yesterday and I wasn't finding a direct source. So, all right. So, aldosterone is a part of the renin, angiotensin, and aldosterone system. So, let's say a person's blood pressure drops. This drop in blood pressure will cause the kidney to release a hormone called renin. Renin will activate angiotensin secreted by the liver to make angiotensin 1. ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme, will interact with angiotensin 1 to make angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 will either cause vasoconstriction directly or travel to the adrenal gland to produce more aldosterone, which will cause sodium and water reabsorption in the bloodstream. All right, here's a question. All right, would anyone like to explain their answer?
I think it's A because the posterior pituitary gland is releasing the ADH, which
Yes.
is the only out of the two hormone other from the oxytocin that's released from the posterior.
Yeah, exactly. So, like you said, a posterior pituitary releases ADH. B, parathyroid releases parathyroid hormone, which does not reduce calcium levels, but rather increases it. Remember, calcitonin tones the bones. It does that by decreasing calcium levels in the blood. So parathyroid hormone would be the opposite. Moving on to C, the posterior pituitary does not release FSH, but rather the anterior pituitary does. And finally, D, oxytocin is released by the posterior pituitary to cause uterine contractions. All right, here's another question. Does anyone have an answer? So the answer would actually, yeah. So to answer this question, you do need to know that Hormone A is ADH because it's acting on the collecting ducts to increase water reabsorption. I mentioned way earlier that ADH is a peptide hormone and aldosterone is a steroid hormone because it ends in "one." So peptide hormones are hydrophilic, so our answer would be A. All right, I have a few more slides left, and I know there's 4 minutes left. I think there's like literally 3 more slides. So please hang in there. All right, the adrenal medulla is responsible for secreting epinephrine and norepinephrine, both of which are responsible for the fight or flight response. These hormones are rapid and short acting. Their purpose is to cause physiological changes that will help you survive in emergencies. These changes would be rapid heart rate, bronchodilation for increased respiration, and redirection of blood flow to your muscles for running or escaping. So how does it redirect blood flow? All right, for the sake of time, I'll answer my own question. So by causing vasodilation to the heart, muscle, and lungs, and it causes vasoconstriction to the skin and guts. Basically, it redirects blood to the organs that need it the most. Another thing that epinephrine does is increase glycogenolysis, which is the breakdown of glycogen. I'm not entirely sure what the difference is between norepinephrine and epinephrine, other than these slight structural changes. But yeah. Finally, we have reached the pancreas. Can anyone tell me why the pancreas is unique?
Because they can regulate the increase and the decrease of the blood sugar level at the same time, which is antagonist to each other.
Yeah, exactly. I was more hinting towards the fact that it's, oh my gosh, that it's, I messed up the animation, but it's an exocrine and an endocrine gland. So the pancreas has ducts where it secretes hormones, but can also secrete hormones into the blood vessel. The pancreas also contains special groups of special cells called islets of Langerhans. These groups contain subgroups of cells called alpha, beta, and delta cells. These cells secrete different hormones. Alpha cells will secrete glucagon, beta cells will secrete insulin, and delta cells will secrete somatostatin. Right, last slide. Glucagon is secreted in times of fasting when our blood sugar is really low and promotes glycogenolysis, which, like I said, is the breakdown of glycogen to glucose, so that there's more glucose in the blood. Insulin, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with, is released after eating when our blood sugar is high. Insulin binds to a receptor on cells that causes the cells to take in glucose from the blood. So let's talk about some disorders involving these hormones. Hyperglycemia means elevated blood sugar levels. This is also known as diabetes mellitus. The easiest way to detect this is by observing high glucose levels in the urine. So some symptoms may include increased urination and thirst, so polyuria and polydipsia respectively. Type 1 diabetes is genetic and is an autoimmune disease that targets beta cells, so insulin cannot be synthesized. This type of diabetes is also called insulin-dependent diabetes because diabetics require insulin injections. Type 2 diabetes is caused by environmental factors such as obesity and is characterized by receptor insensitivity, meaning that the insulin receptors can no longer bind to insulin. So insulin is not administered for treatment, but rather lifestyle changes have to occur. Yes, the pancreas can do it all, unlike me. All right, we reached the end of our topic session. Thank you guys for sticking around. And if you have any questions, you can always email us and also visit our website for more information. To answer Brian's question about the fungal infections way earlier, so fungi are eukaryotic cells. They are not small like bacteria and they can't really enter our cells. So the innate immune system attacks them. Does that make sense? Yeah.
And really quick, when you guys gonna send, I don't know if it's a weekly one, but the sign up for the sessions that I suppose are starting this week?
You mean the practice sessions?
Yes.
Yeah, so we've been doing those for a few weeks. This week was a little bit different, but we're gonna go back to doing those next week.
Oh, good. Okay, thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you, you too.